The 911 call came in at 2:17 a.m., slicing through the thick, humid quiet of a South Georgia night. The caller was a crawfisherman named Earl, his voice a ragged cocktail of whiskey and genuine terror. He'd been running his lines in a backwater channel of the Okefenokee Swamp, a place where the cypress trees stood like ancient skeletal gods, their knees submerged in water, as black and still as polished obsidian. He said he'd seen something wrong. The chrome grille of a Mercedes G-Wagon, glinting in the beam of his headlamp like the teeth of some metallic leviathan half swallowed by the swamp. By the time Detective Leo Chang's unmarked sedan crunched onto the gravel turnout an hour before dawn, the scene was already bathed in the sterile, flashing blue and red of patrol cars. The air, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay, clung to his clothes. Chang was an anomaly in the Atlanta PD, a quiet, meticulously observant man of Asian descent in a department largely defined by the city's black and white dynamics. He didn't command a room with his voice, but with a stillness that made others feel the need to fill the silence, often revealing more than they intended. A local sheriff's deputy, a thick-set man whose uniform was already damp with sweat, led him to the water's edge. "Never seen anything like it, Detective," the deputy grunted, gesturing with his flashlight. "Thing's brand new. Must have cost a damn fortune. Looks like they just drove it straight in." Chang's gaze followed the beam. The G-Wagon was canted at a grotesque angle, its front end submerged, its rear tires hovering just above the brackish water. It was a monument to urban wealth, tragically out of place in this primordial wilderness. It was less a car and more a declaration, and now it was sinking into the muck. "Victim?" Chang asked, his voice low and even. "Car's empty. Divers are suiting up, but this water, it's gator country, and the current, slow as it is, can carry things." The deputy left the rest unsaid. Chang pulled on a pair of latex gloves and approached the vehicle, his boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The rear door was ajar. He carefully pulled it open. The interior was a sanctuary of black leather and polished aluminum, untouched by the swamp's filth. It was pristine, except for two jarring details. On the passenger seat, a single deliberate slash ran 7 inches long across the expensive upholstery, a wound inflicted upon the leather. And on the floor mat below, a smartphone lay shattered, its screen a spiderweb of fractured glass, the damage far too severe for a simple drop. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a joyride gone wrong. This was a statement. The slash suggested rage, a struggle. The broken phone suggested the silencing of communication. It was a carefully staged scene, designed to look like a violent abduction. As the sun began to rise, casting a hazy orange glow through the Spanish moss, the forensics team went to work. The winch truck arrived, its engine a profane roar in the morning's quiet reverence. Slowly, painstakingly, the black beast was dragged from the water, dripping mud and swamp weed, looking like a relic pulled from a forgotten time. Chang stood back, observing, letting the scene speak to him. The G-Wagon represented power, success, and arrival. Its owner wasn't just rich, they were conspicuously so. Who would want to shatter that image so violently? An officer approached him, holding a plastic evidence bag containing a wallet they had found in the glove compartment, miraculously dry. "Got an ID, Detective. The vehicle is registered to a Julian Vance." The name landed with the weight of a stone. Julian Vance wasn't just another wealthy Atlanta resident. He was the Julian Vance, the 32-year-old founder of Nexus Innovations, a tech startup that had become the city's darling, a black man who had broken through the glass ceiling of a predominantly white industry, becoming a symbol of a new, ascendant Atlanta. He was a regular in business magazines, a philanthropist, a testament to the idea that genius and hustle could overcome any barrier. "Run his name," Chang said, his mind already racing. "Check for recent reports." The answer came back in minutes, confirming the dread coiling in his stomach. "We've got one, a missing persons report, filed 3 days ago." "By whom?" The officer checked his screen. "His wife, a Ms. Serena Vance." He paused, then added the detail that turned a strange case into a deeply suspicious one. According to the report, they were married just 6 days ago. Chang looked from the officer back to the wounded, mud-caked G-Wagon. A tech mogul, a symbol of black excellence, disappears 3 days after marrying a new bride, and his chariot is found sacrificed to a swamp, staged to look like a kidnapping. The story was already writing itself, full of sensational, dramatic hooks. But Chang knew the truth was never in the headlines. It was in the details, in the silences, in the things people tried so hard to hide. And in this case, the first place he needed to look for those secrets was the home of the grieving new widow. The Vance residence wasn't a house. It was an architectural statement. Perched on a hill in Buckhead, it was a fortress of glass, steel, and white marble that seemed to float above the manicured green lawns. It was brutally modern, designed for magazine spreads, not for living. As Detective Chang's car crunched up the gravel driveway, he noted the absence of any personal touches. No stray toys, no welcome mat, no sign of the messy, chaotic business of life. It was as sterile and controlled as a gallery. The door was opened by a young woman. For a moment, Chang thought she was a model who had wandered in from a photo shoot. She was tall, with skin the color of warm honey and eyes that were a startling shade of green. She wore a simple but exquisitely cut, cream-colored silk lounge set that probably cost more than Chang's monthly mortgage payment. This was Serena Vance. "Detective Chang?" she asked, her voice a soft, cultured whisper. It held a tremor, but it felt practiced, like a well-rehearsed line in a play. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for seeing me." She led him into a living room that was more of a cavernous atrium. A 20-foot ceiling soared above them, and an entire wall of glass offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The furniture was sparse, artistic, and uncomfortable looking. The air was cool and smelled faintly of jasmine and money. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to a stark white leather sofa. She curled into a matching armchair opposite him, pulling her knees to her chest in a gesture of vulnerability that seemed at odds with the room's severe geometry. Do you have any news about Julian?" Chang took a moment before answering, observing her. Her makeup was flawless, her manicure perfect. Her grief, if it was there, was impeccably curated. "We've located his vehicle, Mrs. Vance. It was found submerged in a body of water south of the city." A perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving no track in her foundation. "Oh my God, was he in it?" The vehicle was empty. "We're treating this as a high-priority missing persons case with suspicious circumstances." She nodded, absorbing the information. "Suspicious? You mean someone took him?" "It's a possibility we're strongly considering," Chang said, opening his small notebook. "I need to ask you about the day he disappeared. You mentioned in your report he was heading to a business meeting." "Yes," she said, her gaze drifting toward the skyline. "He was so driven, always working. He was meeting with new investors for an expansion project. He said it was a huge deal, the one that would finally put Nexus Innovations on the national stage." She spoke of his business with a fluency that surprised Chang. She knew the terminology, the stakes. "Do you know who these investors were? A name for the company?" She hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "He was always so protective of his deals before they were signed. He just called them the West Coast guys. He said they were aggressive, but brilliant. He left around 10 in the morning. He promised he'd be home for dinner." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I waited all night." "You two were married just a week ago," Chang stated, watching her reaction. A genuine warm smile briefly lit up her face, the first truly unguarded emotion he'd seen. "It was a whirlwind. We met 4 months ago. I was hosting a charity gala that he was sponsoring. There was an instant connection. He was the most brilliant, passionate man I'd ever met." She looked down at the enormous diamond on her finger. "He said he'd been waiting his whole life for me. It felt destined." Her fairy tale narrative was smooth, compelling, but Chang's job was to find the torn pages. A man like Julian Vance must have had a complicated life. Any enemies, business rivals who played dirty, anyone who might have been jealous of his success. "Everyone loved Julian," she said, a little too quickly. "He was a pillar of the community. He mentored young black entrepreneurs, gave back constantly. In business, he was tough but fair. I can't imagine anyone wanting to harm him." Chang leaned forward slightly. "What about closer to home? Did his family approve of the quick marriage?" The air in the room seemed to cool by a few degrees. Serena's posture stiffened. "His sister, Amara, she was never my biggest fan. She's very protective of him. She thought, she thought I was just after his money. She gave a small, bitter laugh. As if anyone could be with Julian and not fall in love with his mind, his spirit. And his friends? Chang asked, keeping his tone neutral. Who was he closest to? His best man, perhaps? Serena's eyes flickered, a barely perceptible movement, but Chang caught it. For the first time since he'd arrived, she seemed uncertain. She looked down at her hands, twisting the wedding ring. After a beat of silence that stretched just a second too long, she looked back up. That would be Andre Hayes, she said, her voice regaining its composure. His business partner. They built Nexus from the ground up. They were like brothers. The hesitation was the key. It was a crack in the polished veneer. Why would a wife hesitate to name her husband's best friend and business partner? It was a simple question with a complex answer, and Chang knew, with absolute certainty, that the answer was a door to the secrets this glass house was built to conceal. He had his first thread. Now he just had to pull, add. Amara Vance's law office was the antithesis of her brother's home. Located in a historic brick building in downtown Decatur, it was cramped, chaotic, and overflowing with life. Stacks of case files teetered on every surface. The walls were covered in community awards and photos of her with local activists, and the air smelled of strong coffee and righteous indignation. Amara herself was a force of nature, sharp, intense, with eyes that seemed to dissect everything they looked at. She wore her hair in a proud afro and was dressed in a tailored suit that radiated authority. There was no curated grief here, only a raw, simmering rage. "Let me save you some time, Detective Chang," she began before he'd even sat down, her voice cutting through the office clutter. "You want to know who's responsible for my brother's disappearance? Go look at the 25-year-old gold digger he just put a ring on. This whole thing stinks of her." The venom in her words was startling. Chang sat opposite her desk, letting her vent. "You don't approve of your brother's wife, Ms. Vance." "Approve?" She let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "I ran a background check on her the day he told me he was proposing. I'm a lawyer, detective. I deal in facts, not fairy tales. And the fact is, the woman calling herself Serena is a ghost. Before she appeared in Atlanta a year ago, she didn't exist." She slid a folder across the cluttered desk. "I hired a private investigator, a good one. Cost me a small fortune, but it was worth it. He found her. Her real name, or at least the one she used before this, is Zara. She was in New Orleans for 2 years. And what do you know? She was involved with an older, wealthy hotel magnate. Dated him for a year. 6 months after they broke up, he filed for bankruptcy, claiming his finances had been systematically drained. He never pressed charges against her. Too embarrassed, I suppose. But the timeline is there. She disappears, he's ruined. Then she reappears here as Serena, a blank slate, and within 4 months, she's sunk her claws into my brother. Chang opened the folder. It contained photos of a woman who was undeniably Serena, though she looked younger, her style more garish. She was pictured on the arm of a graying man in New Orleans. The report was detailed, professional. "Julian knew about this?" Chang asked. "I showed it to him," Amara said, her voice softening with pain for the first time. "He accused me of being a bitter, jealous sister who couldn't stand to see him happy. He was blinded. She played her part perfectly, the adoring, supportive partner. He wanted to believe in it so badly." "Why would he need to?" Amara leaned back, her gaze turning distant. "Because being Julian Vance is exhausting, detective. You see the magazine covers, the TED Talks, the triumphant narrative of the black tech genius. You don't see the reality. You don't see him having to be twice as smart, twice as prepared, just to be taken half as seriously in boardrooms full of old white men. You don't see the banks that gave him higher interest rates, the investors who scrutinized his projections with a skepticism they never showed his white counterparts. He built an empire, yes, but he was under constant crushing pressure to maintain the illusion of effortless success. This was the context Chang had been missing. The story wasn't just about money. It was about the heavy price of being a symbol. "He was a target," Amara continued, her anger returning. "A successful black man is always a target. And Serena, or Zara, or whatever her name is, she knew exactly how to exploit his one vulnerability. His desire for a safe harbor, a place where he didn't have to fight, where he was just loved. She sold him a fantasy and he bought it wholesale. Chang absorbed the information, his mind connecting the dots. Serena's calculated grief, her hesitation at the mention of Andre Hayes, and now this damning report from Amara. The picture of the grieving widow was shattering, being replaced by that of a professional predator. "My brother is a brilliant man," Amara said, her voice low and fierce. "But his brilliance is in code, in algorithms. When it comes to people, he trusts too much. He wants to see the good, and she is a black hole disguised as a star." "Your investigator's report," Chang said, tapping the folder. "Is it complete? Did he find any other connections from her time in New Orleans? Anyone she might still be in contact with?" He said he was still digging into her employment history there, some jazz club she worked at. But he was confident the important part was the rich man she fleeced. Chang closed the folder, his next steps becoming clear. He needed to talk to that investigator. He needed to dig deeper into Zara from New Orleans. And he needed to understand the true state of Julian Vance's supposedly glittering empire. As he stood to leave, Amara fixed him with a hard, pleading stare. "Find him, detective. That woman is a viper, and I'm afraid my brother has finally been bitten." The warning hung in the air, heavy and prophetic. Julian Vance wasn't just missing. He was a man who, in his desperate search for a sanctuary, may have willingly walked into a predator's den. And Chang was beginning to suspect she hadn't been working alone. Detective Chang believed in the gospel of numbers. People lied, memories faded, emotions clouded judgment. But financial records were unflinching storytellers. They held no grudges and offered no sentiment. They simply stated the facts. After his meeting with the fiery Amara Vance, he spent the next 48 hours submerged in the digital life of Julian Vance. And the story the numbers told was a chilling departure from the public narrative. He sat in his small, cluttered cubicle, the glow of his monitor casting a pale light on his face as the rest of the precinct buzzed around him. With warrants fast-tracked due to the high-profile nature of the case, he had gained access to everything. Nexus Innovations' corporate accounts, Julian's personal banking, his investment portfolios, and his lines of credit. The public image of Nexus Innovations was one of meteoric success. It was the scrappy Atlanta startup that had developed a revolutionary data compression algorithm, landing lucrative contracts with media and logistics companies. Press releases boasted of exponential growth and imminent expansion. The reality, hidden in the spreadsheets, was a portrait of desperation. The company was hemorrhaging money. For the past 18 months, expenses had consistently outpaced revenue. Key clients had been lost, and a recent product launch had been a costly failure. To maintain the facade of success, Julian had been engaged in a frantic dance of debt. He had maxed out business loans, taken out second and third mortgages on commercial properties, and, most alarmingly, had begun borrowing from private lenders. These weren't venture capitalists. They were hard money lenders, the kind who operated in legal gray areas and didn't file lawsuits when you defaulted. Their names were on a series of promissory notes Chang found buried in a subfolder on Julian's cloud drive. The interest rates were predatory, and the sums were staggering. Julian Vance wasn't just in debt. He was drowning in it, and the sharks were circling. The pressure Amara had described wasn't just psychological. It was existential. His entire empire, the symbol of black excellence he had built, was a spectacular house of cards, one stiff breeze away from total collapse. This discovery radically altered the list of potential suspects. The jilted business rival theory was out. A kidnapper seeking ransom was unlikely. There was nothing left to ransom. But the private lenders, they were a very real threat. A man who couldn't pay could be made into an example. The marriage to Serena now looked different too. Was it a desperate attempt to secure a partner with her own resources? Chang did a quick financial trace on Serena. Nothing. She was, as Amara claimed, a ghost. She had no assets, no credit history to speak of. She hadn't brought money into the marriage. She was poised to take what was left. He cross-referenced the timelines. Julian's financial situation had taken a nosedive about 2 years ago. He had met Serena 4 months ago. The proposal came 3 months ago. The wedding, 1 week ago. The disappearance, 3 days after that. The sequence was tight, almost like a carefully planned demolition. Lost in the labyrinth of figures, Chang almost missed it. It was a single transaction, made the day before Julian disappeared. While his other accounts were frozen or overdrawn, one personal checking account showed a sudden, massive withdrawal. It was a cashier's check, followed by a cash disbursement from a branch in Midtown. $100,000. In the context of his multi-million-dollar debts, it wasn't a fortune, but for a man with no liquidity, it was everything. Where had he gotten it? And more importantly, what was it for? A payoff? An escape fund? Ransom for himself? Chang immediately requested the surveillance footage from the bank. An hour later, the video file appeared in his inbox. He clicked play. The timestamp confirmed the date and time. The footage was clear. Julian Vance, dressed in a sharp suit but with his tie loosened, walked up to the teller. There was no one with him. He showed no signs of duress. His movements were calm, efficient, focused. He didn't look like a man being coerced. He looked like a man on a mission. He exchanged the check, took the large manila envelope filled with cash, and walked out of the frame. Chang played the clip again, then a third time. Julian wasn't a victim being forced to empty his account. He was the architect of the transaction. He had orchestrated this withdrawal. This single piece of evidence contradicted the entire abduction theory they had been building. A man who is about to be kidnapped doesn't calmly withdraw his last $100,000 in cash. A man who is about to disappear, however, does. The revelation settled over Chang with a cold certainty. The G-Wagon in the swamp, the slash seat, the broken phone, it was all a brilliant piece of theater. A misdirection designed to send the police hunting for violent phantoms while the real victim, or perhaps the real perpetrator, vanished into the ether. Julian Vance hadn't been taken. He had run. The question was no longer who had taken him, but what or whom was he running from? Was he fleeing his crushing debt and the dangerous men he owed? Or was he running from something far more intimate and treacherous? Chang minimized the bank footage, his mind already shifting. He now had to find the trail not of a victim, but of a fugitive. And that meant going back to the beginning, to the place where Julian's carefully constructed world had been left to die, the Okefenokee Swamp. The Okefenokee Swamp felt different on the second visit. The initial shock of the crime scene had faded, replaced by a quiet, oppressive sense of mystery. The yellow police tape that remained, fluttering from cypress branches, seemed like a futile attempt to impose human order on a place that had none. Detective Chang stood on the muddy bank where the G-Wagon had been pulled from the water, the tire tracks now faint impressions in the drying earth. The abduction theory had crumbled, but the scene itself still held clues. It was a stage, and Julian was the director. Chang needed to figure out what story he was trying to tell. Standard procedure in a missing persons case, especially in a wilderness area, called for a canine search. Initially, it had been a search for a body. Now, it was a search for a ghost trail. Officer Maya Reed, the head of the K9 unit, arrived with her partner. Rocco was a magnificent German shepherd, all business and coiled energy. His coat was a deep sable, his eyes intelligent and intensely focused. He wasn't a pet. He was a highly trained instrument, his nose capable of deciphering scents 1,000,000 times more subtle than any human could detect. "What are we looking for, Leo?" Reed asked, her hand resting reassuringly on Rocco's back. "Julian Vance. We now have reason to believe he left this scene voluntarily," Chang explained. "The abduction was staged. I need to know where he went. We have a scent article from his home office, a worn leather desk chair." Reed nodded, understanding immediately. She opened a sealed evidence bag and let Rocco get a long, deep sniff of a piece of fabric cut from the chair. His nostrils flared, his brain processing the unique cocktail of skin cells, sweat, and pheromones that constituted Julian's scent signature. Then she gave the command. "Seek!" Rocco went to work. He first circled the area where the G-Wagon had been, confirming the presence of Julian's scent inside and around the vehicle. This was expected. Then he cast a wider net. He ignored the water's edge, showing no interest in the diver's search grid. He ignored the deep woods, where a man might hide a body. Instead, his nose led him with unerring confidence away from the swamp itself. He moved past the police tape, past the gravel turnout where the official vehicles had parked. He followed a path that was almost invisible to the human eye, a faint trail through the tall grass and palmettos that ran parallel to the main road. Chang and Reed followed, their boots rustling through the undergrowth. The air was thick with the drone of insects. Rocco was methodical. his tail held low, his entire being concentrated on the invisible thread of scent. He was reading a story written in molecules, a story of a man's passage through this place. The trail was clear, strong. Julian hadn't just been here. He'd walked this way deliberately. After about 200 yards, the faint path intersected with a dirt access road, little more than 2 ruts in the red Georgia clay, used by park rangers or illegal hunters. Here, Rocco became agitated. He circled the spot where the path met the road, whining softly, his nose pressed to the ground. Then, he looked up at Reed and barked once. A definitive, final statement. "He's lost the scent," Reed said, patting Rocco's head. "It ends right here, clean cut." Chang surveyed the scene. The dirt road was soft, and in the morning light, he could just make out faint tire tracks, different from the heavy-duty treads of the Park Service vehicles. They were the tracks of a regular sedan. "He was picked up," Chang said, the pieces clicking into place. "He drove the G-Wagon into the swamp, staged the scene, walked up this path, and got into another vehicle that was waiting for him right here." It was a clean exit. No witnesses, no cameras, no loose ends. Julian had planned this meticulously. As they stood there, Rocco, still sniffing the area, suddenly became fixated on a small clump of weeds at the edge of the road. He began digging furiously with his front paws, sending dirt flying. "What's he got, boy?" Reed encouraged. Rocco pulled back, and nestled in the freshly turned earth was a small metallic object. Chang knelt, using a gloved hand to pick it up. It was a key, not a car key or a house key, but a small old-fashioned brass key with a number stamped on it. 317. It was a key to a safe deposit box. A wave of understanding washed over Chang. A man running for his life, orchestrating a complex disappearance, doesn't accidentally drop a key to his last bastion of secrets unless he is under extreme stress. This wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a mistake. It was the first mistake Julian Vance had made. The plan was brilliant, but the execution had been flawed by human error, by the adrenaline and fear of the moment. And now, thanks to the sensitive nose of a German shepherd, Chang held the key. He didn't know what it opened or where the box was located, but he knew one thing for certain. It was the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. Julian hadn't just vanished with $100,000. He was protecting something else, something valuable enough to hide in a bank vault. And Chang had a strong suspicion it wasn't money. It was leverage. The small brass key burned a hole in Detective Chang's pocket, a tangible link to the fugitive he was hunting. While his team worked on the monumental task of checking every bank in Georgia for a safe deposit box numbered 317 registered to Julian Vance, or a known alias, Chang turned his attention back to the other ghost in the machine. Serena, or, as he now knew her, Zara from New Orleans. He reached out to the private investigator Amara Vance had hired, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank Miller, who had a cynical view of humanity that Chang found refreshingly honest. "You were right to call, Detective," Miller said over the phone, his voice a gravelly baritone. "There was more to that story. I sent an update to Ms. Vance, but with everything going on, she might not have seen it. The jazz club Zara worked at in the French Quarter, it wasn't just some random gig." Chang leaned forward, pen poised over his notebook. "Go on." "It was called the Blue Note. High-end place. Old money, tourists with deep pockets. She wasn't a waitress, she was a hostess. Her job was to make the wealthy patrons feel important. I did some digging into the club's ownership records. It was owned for 2 years by a holding company. And the holding company was owned by," Chang prompted. "A man who sold it right before he moved to Atlanta to start a new business venture," Miller said, letting the suspense hang in the air for a beat. "The man's name is Andre Hayes." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Andre Hayes, Julian's business partner, his best man, his brother. The man Serena had hesitated to name. The connection wasn't just a coincidence. It was the entire foundation of the conspiracy. They had known each other long before Julian Vance was ever in the picture. Andre hadn't just met his partner's new girlfriend. He had likely handpicked her. "They played him," Chang said, the words barely a whisper. "From the very beginning." "Looks that way," Miller confirmed. "Hayes set up shop in Atlanta, partnered with your tech genius." A year or so later, his old employee, Zara, shows up with a new name and a clean slate and accidentally bumps into the rich, stressed-out partner. It's a classic long con detective. Textbook. After hanging up with Miller, Chang felt a cold fury settle over him. Julian Vance, for all his intelligence, had been emotionally blindsided. He was the mark, and his best friend and his wife were the grifters. The financial ruin of Nexus Innovations was no longer just a backdrop. It was the stage on which this betrayal had been set. Andre and Serena weren't trying to get a piece of a thriving empire. They were picking the bones of a dying one. The question was, what was their endgame? Ruining him financially wasn't enough. The elaborate staging of the disappearance suggested something more final. The pieces began to rearrange themselves in Chang's mind with sickening clarity. A failing business, a staged abduction, a new wife, a best friend. It was a triangle, but not one of love. It was a triangle of pure, predatory greed. Chang pulled up all the information he had on Andre Hayes. On the surface, he was the charismatic counterpart to Julian's quiet genius. Andre was the networker, the deal maker, the public face of the company. He was handsome, well-dressed, and universally liked. He was the one who smoothed things over, who reassured investors, who kept the ship looking steady even as it was taking on water. He had given a tearful interview to a local news station just yesterday, pleading for his brother's safe return. It was a masterful performance. Now, knowing his connection to Serena, Andre's every action seemed sinister. His public grief was a lie. His loyalty was a mask. He hadn't been trying to save the company. He had been drilling holes in the hull while pretending to bail water. Chang's phone buzzed. It was the Financial Crimes Unit. "Leo, you're not going to believe this," the voice on the other end said. "We were doing a final sweep of Julian Vance's insurance policies, standard procedure. We found one we missed, a big one, a key person policy taken out on Julian by the company." "How big?" Chang asked, already dreading the answer. $5 million. Chang's blood ran cold. And the beneficiary? Standardly, it would be the company itself to ensure continuity. But the policy was amended 2 weeks ago, right after he got married. There was a pause. The new beneficiaries are split, 60% to his wife, Serena Vance, and 40% to his business partner, Andre Hayes. There it was, the motive. It wasn't about the $100,000 in cash or the failing company's remaining assets. It was never about that. It was about $5 million in clean, untraceable insurance money. All it required was for Julian Vance to be declared dead. The staged abduction wasn't just to cover his escape. It was the first act in having him legally erased. They weren't just trying to make him disappear. They were trying to make him a ghost in the eyes of the law. Chang stood up, grabbing his jacket. The time for digging through papers was over. He now had the connection, the motive, and the proof of a conspiracy. It was time to talk to the puppeteer. It was time to pay a visit to Mr. Andre Hayes and see how well his performance held up when the stage lights were turned off and the theater went dark. The Nexus Innovations office was a temple of modern tech culture. Located in a repurposed warehouse in West Midtown, it was an open-plan space with exposed brick, polished concrete floors, and glass-walled conference rooms named after famous scientists. Young, bright-eyed employees typed away at sleek monitors, the air buzzing with the low hum of servers and ambition. It was an environment designed to project innovation and success, a perfect mask for the decay rotting the company from within. Andre Hayes greeted Detective Chang in the lobby, his hand outstretched, a practiced, somber expression on his handsome face. He wore a tailored suit with no tie, a look that broadcast both authority and creative approachability. "Detective," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Any news? We're all on edge here. The team is falling apart without Julian." "That's what I'd like to talk to you about, Mr. Hayes," Chang replied, his handshake firm but brief. In private. Andre led him to his corner office, a minimalist space with a commanding view of the city. He offered Chang a bottle of sparkling water, which the detective declined. Andre sat behind a large, empty desk, a picture of a man in control, a captain on the bridge of his ship. "Please, ask me anything, whatever helps find Julian," Andre said, leaning forward with an air of earnest cooperation. Chang started with the basics, asking Andre to recount the last time he saw Julian, to describe his state of mind. Andre's story was polished and consistent with Serena's. Julian was stressed but optimistic about the West Coast investors. He was deeply in love with his new wife. He was a brilliant but sometimes troubled genius. It's no secret the company has faced headwinds, Andre admitted, preempting Chang's line of questioning. Every startup does. Julian took it personally. He carried the weight of it all on his shoulders. I was worried he was close to burning out. You knew him well, Chang observed. Like a brother, I'm told. Absolutely, Andre nodded. 15 years. We built this from nothing, just two guys with a dream. I'd do anything for him. Chang let the statement hang in the air for a moment before he made his move. He slid a photograph across the polished surface of the desk. It was a grainy but clear image, pulled from the PI's file. A younger Andre Hayes, standing behind the bar at the Blue Note in New Orleans, with a smiling Zara, now Serena, at his side, her arm linked comfortably through his. Does she look familiar to you? Chang asked, his voice quiet. Andre stared at the photo. For a fraction of a second, his mask of calm slipped. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes before being instantly suppressed. He looked up, forcing a small, dismissive laugh. Wow, that's a blast from the past. Yeah, I remember her. She worked for me for a few months years ago. Small world, huh? A very small world, Chang agreed. So small, in fact, that your former hostess ends up in Atlanta, marries your best friend and business partner, and you never think to mention that you knew her intimately? It was a fling, detective. A mistake, a long time ago. It had nothing to do with Julian, Andre said, his tone becoming defensive. When Serena showed up here, we were both shocked. We agreed it would be complicated. To tell Julian would have just caused unnecessary drama. He was happy. I didn't want to ruin that for him. The explanation was plausible, if you were charitable, but Chang wasn't feeling charitable. You didn't want to ruin his happiness, or you didn't want to ruin your plan. What plan? Andre scoffed, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. The only plan was to make this company a success. Let's talk about another plan then, Chang said, his voice hardening slightly. He slid a second document across the desk. It was a copy of the amendment to the Nexus Innovations Key Person Insurance Policy. He had highlighted the beneficiary clause. A $5 million plan. A plan where you and Serena become the beneficiaries of your partner's life insurance policy, just 2 weeks before he vanishes under violent circumstances. That's quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? The blood drained from Andre's face. The charming, confident facade didn't just crack, it shattered. He stared at the paper, then back at Chang, his eyes wide with the terror of a man whose intricate scheme has just been exposed. The performer was off script, the safety net gone. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped. The friendly concern, the brotherly love, it had all been part of the act, and the performance was officially over. Chang leaned back in his chair, the silence in the room more damning than any accusation. He didn't need to press. He knew from experience that in the silent void left by a collapsing lie, the truth often rushes in to fill the space. And Andre Hayes was about to tell him a story. It wouldn't be the whole truth, not yet. It would be a new, revised performance designed for survival. But it would be a start. For a full minute, Andre Hayes said nothing. He simply stared at the insurance document on his desk as if it were a venomous snake. The calculated charisma had evaporated, leaving behind the raw, pallid fear of a man who has been cornered. The air in the glass-walled office crackled with unspoken truths. Finally, he slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "It's not what it looks like," he whispered, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Then tell me what it is," Chang said, his voice calm, giving Andre just enough rope. Andre ran a hand over his face, his composure completely gone. The plan, it was Julian's idea, all of it. It was a classic move. Shift the blame to the person who wasn't there to defend himself. Chang remained silent, his expression unreadable, inviting Andre to continue digging his own grave. "The company was finished," Andre said, his voice gaining a desperate energy. "We were months from insolvency. The lenders Julian brought in, they weren't bankers, detective. They were vultures. They were making threats, not just against him, but against his sister, against anyone he cared about. We were trapped. We had no way out. He looked up at Chong, his eyes pleading for understanding. Julian came to me about a month ago. He was a wreck. He said there was only one way out, the insurance policy. It was our only real asset left. He said if he disappeared, the money would be enough to pay off the sharks and save what was left of the company. It was the only way to protect Amara. According to Andre's new narrative, Julian was the mastermind of his own disappearance, a desperate man making a desperate move. Andre and Serena were merely reluctant accomplices, drawn into the scheme out of loyalty and love. "So you all planned it together?" Chang asked, keeping his tone skeptical. "You, Serena, and Julian? This was a joint venture?" "Yes," Andre said, seizing the lifeline. "Julian knew about Serena and me from the past. He didn't care. He said it proved he could trust us both. He said we were the only two people on Earth who had as much to lose as he did." The story was intricate, detailed. Andre explained how Julian had meticulously planned every step, how he chose the Okefenokee swamp because it was remote and its reputation would add to the mystery, how Julian himself slashed the seat and smashed his own phone to create the illusion of a violent struggle. The $100,000 in cash was to be the seed money for his new life while he waited for the insurance to pay out. He was supposed to lay low for a year or two until he was legally declared dead, Andre continued, the words spilling out in a torrent. Then the insurance money would clear the debts. After things cooled down, he would reappear somewhere in Mexico or South America, claiming amnesia. It was a crazy plan, but it was the only one we had. I went along with it to protect him, to protect the company we built. "And Serena?" Chang asked. "What was her role in this noble sacrifice?" "She was supposed to be the grieving widow," Andre said, without a hint of irony. "She would play the part, deal with the police, manage the estate. Julian trusted her. He really did love her, and she loved him. We all just wanted to survive this." The confession was a masterpiece of self-preservation. It admitted to a serious crime, insurance fraud, but skillfully painted Andre as a loyal friend, and Julian as the desperate, controlling architect of the entire affair. It neatly explained the insurance policy change, the connection to Serena, and the staged crime scene. It was a plausible, self-contained narrative that reframed Andre from a predator into a misguided protector. But Chang knew it was just another performance, a more sophisticated one. There were still too many holes. If they were all in it together, why was Julian running from them? And why had Andre and Serena hidden their past connections so fiercely if Julian had already known and approved? "So, if this was the plan," Chang said, leaning forward, "and everyone was on the same page, what went wrong?" Andre's eyes darted away, his gaze falling on the city skyline. He swallowed hard, as if the next part of the story was difficult to tell. "He betrayed us," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with manufactured pain. "At the last minute, Julian betrayed us all. It was the perfect cliffhanger, designed to cast Julian as the ultimate villain and Andre as the final victim. But Chang wasn't buying a ticket to this show. He was here to shut it down." The air in the office grew heavy as Andre Hayes delivered his final, desperate twist. He portrayed himself and Serena as the victims, loyal soldiers abandoned on the battlefield by a commander who had lost his nerve. "Everything was set," Andre continued, his voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur. He leaned forward across his desk, as if sharing a terrible secret. "Julian was supposed to leave the G-Wagon, meet a contact who would drive him to a private airfield, and then fly to a prearranged safe house in Costa Rica. Serena and I were here, establishing our alibis, waiting for his call to confirm he was safe." He paused for dramatic effect, shaking his head in feigned disbelief. The call never came. Instead, the next day, the news broke about his car being found. It was too soon. He was supposed to stay hidden for weeks, to let the mystery build. By leaving the car so obviously, he accelerated everything. And then, we realized the money was gone. "The $100,000, Chang stated. "It wasn't just his money," Andre corrected, his voice laced with indignation. "It was our escape fund. A portion of it was my personal savings. He was supposed to use it to set up his new life, but he was also supposed to leave a portion for us, to handle legal fees, to keep the lights on here while we waited. But he took it all. The story was designed to be the ultimate betrayal. Julian, the supposed mastermind, had used his partner's trust and resources to orchestrate his own escape, leaving them behind to face the fallout. The police investigation, the furious lenders, the collapse of the company. He had turned their desperate rescue mission into his own personal lifeboat, cutting them loose in the stormy seas. "He played us," Andre said, the bitterness in his voice sounding almost genuine. He used his own financial crisis and the threats against him as a cover story to get us to help him disappear. But his real plan was just to run, to leave us holding the bag. "That's a serious accusation," Chang said, his face impassive. "Do you have any proof of this? Any proof that Julian is alive and that he double-crossed you?" "Yes," Andre said, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He reached for his phone, his fingers tapping quickly on the screen. "He got careless, or maybe he just wanted to rub it in our faces." He turned the phone around and pushed it across the desk. On the screen was a single text message received 2 days after Julian's disappearance. The sender was an unknown number. The message was short and brutal. "Plan changed. I'm on my own. Don't look for me." Chang studied the message. It was the perfect piece of evidence to support Andre's story. It was a digital confession, a final goodbye from a man who had just betrayed his closest confidants. "We were terrified," Andre said, taking the phone back. "We didn't know what to do. If we went to the police and told the truth, we'd be confessing to insurance fraud. We were trapped, so we stuck to the original story, hoping he'd turn up and we could sort it out. But he was gone. The story was complete, hermetically sealed. It accounted for every strange detail of the case. It provided a motive, a method, and a plausible reason for Andre and Serena's lies. It painted Julian as a cold, calculating betrayer, and them as his unfortunate, loyal dupes. It was, in its own way, a work of art. But Chang knew that the most beautiful lies were often built around a kernel of truth. Andre had admitted to the fraud, a crime he now knew the police could prove. In exchange, he had offered up a narrative that absolved him of anything worse, while simultaneously pointing the investigation in a new direction. A manhunt for Julian Vance, the fugitive. "I'll need that phone," Chang said, standing up. "And the number that message came from. We'll trace it." "Of course," Andre said, handing it over willingly. He looked relieved, like a man who had just successfully navigated a minefield. He believed he had given the police a new target, a new villain. He thought he had saved himself. As Chang walked out of the gleaming office, he held the phone in his hand. Andre thought this was Julian's biggest mistake, but Chang suspected it was Andre's. A burner phone, a cryptic message. It was all too convenient, too perfectly timed. It wasn't the clumsy mistake of a man on the run. It felt like another move in a calculated game. Andre had given him a trail to follow, confident it would lead away from him. But Chang had a feeling that if he followed it to its end, it would lead him right back to the truth Andre was still trying to bury. The text message from the burner phone was Andre Hayes' gambit, a calculated risk designed to send the police on a wild goose chase after a new villain. But for the Atlanta PD's tech unit, a burner phone wasn't an impenetrable fortress. It was a puzzle, and it didn't take them long to solve it. The phone had been purchased with cash from a gas station in Gainesville, an hour north of Atlanta. It had been activated, used to send that single text message to Andre, and then powered off. But in the brief moments it was active, it pinged a cell tower. The signal's triangulation was rough, but it placed the phone's last known location within a 20-square-mile area of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Georgia, a rugged, isolated region of dense forests, winding roads, and sparse population. It was the perfect place to disappear. Andre's story was that Julian was on his way to Costa Rica, a tropical paradise. The Appalachian Mountains were the opposite, a cold, unforgiving wilderness. The discrepancy was glaring. Chang didn't believe Julian was a ruthless mastermind enjoying a tropical getaway. He believed Julian was a terrified man hiding in the mountains. He was a rabbit who had bolted, and Andre, the fox, had deliberately pointed the hunters in his general direction, perhaps hoping they'd flush him out. Chang assembled a small, discreet team, himself, his trusted partner, Detective Miller, and 2 uniformed officers from the local sheriff's department who knew the mountain terrain. This wasn't going to be a media-saturated manhunt with helicopters and roadblocks. This was going to be a quiet, methodical search. They were hunting a man who was already running scared. The last thing they needed was to spook him into doing something desperate. They drove north from Atlanta, leaving the sprawling cityscape behind for the rolling foothills that gradually sharpened into mountains. The air grew cooler, cleaner. They established a command post in a small diner in Dahlonega, spreading a topographical map across a booth table. "The search area is huge," the local sheriff, a man named Hackett, said, tracing a circle on the map with a thick finger. "Mostly Chattahoochee National Forest, but there are hundreds of private cabins, hunting lodges, old moonshiner shacks tucked away in these hills. He could be anywhere." "He's not a survivalist," Chang countered, thinking of the polished tech mogul. "He's a city guy. He'll need shelter, electricity, some connection to the outside world, however small. Let's start by cross-referencing property records within the ping zone. Look for rentals, recent sales, properties owned by shell corporations, anything that might not be immediately obvious." The work was slow, painstaking. For a day they chased down dead ends. Then they got a hit. A small, secluded cabin on the Toccoa River, owned by an LLC with opaque registration. But a deeper dive into the LLC's formation. Documents revealed a familiar name listed as a secondary agent on an old filing, Julian Vance. He had bought the property 3 years ago, a secret getaway that not even his sister, Amara, seemed to know about. It was his bolt hole, his emergency exit from the world. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, casting long, deep shadows through the valleys, Chang's team moved out. They drove their vehicles as close as they could, then proceeded the last half-mile on foot, moving silently through the dense woods. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves under their boots and the distant murmur of the river. The cabin came into view, nestled in a clearing. It was a simple log structure, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A single light glowed in a window. There was a car parked beside it, not a rental, but a battered 10-year-old pickup truck, the kind that wouldn't draw a second glance on these mountain roads. They took up positions surrounding the cabin. Chang felt a knot of tension in his chest. This was the most dangerous moment. They didn't know Julian's state of mind. Was he armed? Suicidal? Would he run? Chung raised the radio to his lips. "This is Detective Chang with the Atlanta PD. We have the house surrounded. Julian Vance, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up. We just want to talk." His voice echoed in the quiet clearing. For a long moment, there was no response. The light in the window remained on. The smoke continued its slow dance from the chimney. The silence stretched, thick with possibility. Chong was about to repeat the command when the cabin door creaked open. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm light from within. It was Julian Vance. He looked thin, exhausted, his expensive suit replaced by jeans and a worn flannel shirt. He had a beard, the beginnings of a man trying to erase his former self. But it was his eyes that were the most changed. The confident, brilliant gaze from the magazine covers was gone. In its place was the haunted, terrified look of a hunted animal. He slowly raised his hands, not in defiance, but in weary surrender. "I knew you'd find me," he said, his voice raspy. "I just hoped it would be you, and not them." In that moment, Chang knew with absolute certainty that this was not the face of a man who had betrayed his friends. This was the face of a man who had run for his life, and the story he was about to tell would be the final, horrifying truth. Inside the small, rustic cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth, a stark contrast to the cold reality that was about to unfold. Julian Vance sat at a simple wooden table, a mug of steaming coffee untouched in front of him. The bravado of the tech titan was gone, replaced by the quiet fragility of a man who had seen the abyss. Detective Chang sat opposite him, his notebook open, his presence calm and patient. "Andre's story is that you masterminded the whole thing," Chang began, his voice even. "The insurance fraud, the disappearance, and that in the end, you betrayed them and ran with the money." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Julian's lips. "Of course, that's his story. Andre is a brilliant storyteller. It's his greatest talent. He can sell anyone on anything." He looked up, his eyes meeting Chang's. "And yes, I agreed to the plan. That part is true. I was desperate. The business was gone, and the men I owed money to, they don't file lawsuits, detective. I saw the insurance money as the only way to protect my sister, to make them go away. I was a fool. I was so focused on the sharks in the water, I never saw the snakes in my own boat." The truth, as Julian told it, was far more sinister than a simple betrayal over money. It was 2 nights before I was supposed to disappear, Julian recounted, his voice low, haunted. I was at the office late, going over the final details. Andre and Serena thought I had gone home. They came into the main conference room. I was in my office, the door slightly ajar. I heard them talking. He paused, swallowing hard, the memory still raw. At first it was just logistics, but then the tone changed. Andre was talking about the insurance payout. Serena was worried. What if he actually comes back? She asked. What if this amnesia story doesn't work? Julian leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. And then I heard Andre laugh, a cold, chilling sound. He told her not to worry. He said, "Ghosts don't come back." He started talking about how, after the insurance money came through, there would need to be a tragic accident, a boating mishap on a lake in a few months, something final, something that would make sure the amnesiac Julian Vance could never reappear and complicate their new lives. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Chang's mind with sickening finality. It was never a rescue mission. It was an execution in 2 acts. The disappearance was Act 1, designed to unlock the money. The accidental death was Act 2, designed to silence the only person who could expose them. Julian wasn't a partner in the crime. He was the asset being liquidated. I realized I was already a dead man, Julian whispered. My best friend and my wife were planning to murder me. The whole relationship, the whirlwind romance. It was all part of the setup. Andre brought her in. He knew I was vulnerable, knew I was drowning. He didn't throw me a life raft. He threw me an anchor disguised as an angel. That night, Julian's plan changed from insurance fraud to pure survival. He executed the disappearance as they had planned, but instead of going to the airfield, he used the cash to buy the old truck, discard his phone for a burner, and flee to the one place no one knew existed. He sent the text message to Andre, not as a taunt, but as a desperate attempt to make them think he was long gone, to buy himself time. Based on Julian's testimony, arrest warrants were issued immediately for Andre Hayes and Serena Vance. They were apprehended at Julian's mansion, reportedly in the middle of a celebratory champagne toast. Their shock and indignation were, like everything else, a masterful performance that crumbled under the weight of Julian's story. They were charged with conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Julian Vance was also arrested. His confession to his role in the initial fraud plot made him a criminal in the eyes of the law, even if he was a victim of a larger conspiracy. As Detective Leo Chang stood outside the courthouse weeks later, watching Amara Vance post her brother's bail, he reflected on the wreckage. 3 lives, intertwined by ambition and love, or what passed for it, had been utterly destroyed. Andre and Serena's greed had led them to plot a murder. Julian's desperation and pride, his inability to admit his perfect empire was failing, had led him to commit a crime that opened the door to his own would-be executioners. The city lights of Atlanta twinkled below, a sea of infinite promise and ambition. Julian Vance had been one of its brightest stars, but his story served as a dark, cautionary tale. It was a story about the crushing pressure to succeed, the subtle poisons of systemic bias, and the terrifying speed at which friendships can curdle into betrayal when millions of dollars are on the line. The final lesson was stark and simple. When you build your life on a foundation of lies, whether to the world or to yourself, that foundation will inevitably crumble. And when it does, it doesn't matter how high you've built your tower. Everyone falls,